Not that you won't be able to fill up your car because there's no more gasoline. You won't be able to fill up your car because it's prohibitively expensive. As an organization, we have historically brought together former military leaders and business leaders to discuss the security implications of energy supply chains and national security. Energy security, as we see it, is the ability for a country or for an individual to meet their energy needs. So, being able to consume energy at an affordable price. At an individual level, we see that taking place every time somebody fills up their gas tank or turns on the lights and receives a power bill. At a national level, where we usually operate, that's viewed as a country's ability or a set of allies' ability to meet their own energy needs through global markets primarily that are relatively stable. We don't just view it as the inability to access, we also view it as a cost challenge. And that's certainly where Americans, Germans alike are increasingly feeling the pain of that lack of security, whether it's a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's the disruption of Russian natural gas, seeing the very real impacts on an individual's pocketbook. Again, it's not that you won't be able to fill up your car because there's no more gasoline. You won't be able to fill up your car because it's prohibitively expensive. Oftentimes, you hear these conversations around energy independence. We don't think that's possible. We think about it as security. And the idea of not having to rely on any sort of external market for your energy needs is simply not possible in a globally connected market. You can produce more than you consume, which the US does currently, but that doesn't mean that you're not still subject to volatility from global disruptions. On the electricity side, again, similar sort of challenge where the need to produce, to activate a diverse portfolio of energy resources is how we think about security. So that when there is a disruption to supply, it's not if, it's when, that you have alternatives that you can fall back on in order to ensure that while prices may spike, that supplies aren't ultimately cut off. Absolutely. For many Americans, it's a question of prices at home, but there's a lot of concern right now around gas prices that are relatively high by recent US calibration, and same with power prices, which are on the rise. I think there's a similar concern that because these are globally priced commodities, if prices go up in the US, it means by extension they're going up in Europe and around the world as well. So I think that that's kind of how that plays out, where it's not an everyday concern for the American consumer that European energy prices are high, but it's a concern that global prices are increasing or are spiking. You have a couple of different options for how to address high prices. One of them is you can use less, you can be more efficient. We believe that's good. The other is you can produce more, have more supply, which we also believe is a good mechanism. And then the third piece is obviously diversification. So ensuring that you have alternatives for the sorts of economic and personal needs that you might have. Getting from A to B is a great example. Historically, that would be done using a gasoline powered vehicle. Increasingly, there is either hybrid technology or fully electric technologies. And having that ability to diversify, to shift away from a globally priced fossil fuel to a domestically priced electricity set is something that we have long viewed as a mechanism toward that sort of an energy security end goal. Critical mineral supply chains. I think that's one where the solution to critical minerals supply chain security is you need more supply, particularly with the amount of sectors that are increasingly going to need things like rare earth magnets, graphite, lithium, germanium, gallium, and geology is tough. The rocks are where they are. It's going to take an allied approach to that sort of a solution set for critical mineral supply chain security, which will require, working with allies globally to identify where those resources can be extracted and where they can be processed. Energy storage is going to be a core component of addressing energy demand needs and ultimately energy security. Energy storage is very likely to be driven through batteries. That's where we see the increase in demand and the supply chain choke points that have been heavily documented at this point, where huge proportions of that come from one country right now, China. There's been an increased focus on what we call the midstream, so processing of those minerals. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good if you get the nickel or the copper or the rare earths out of the ground in the US or in the EU. If you then have to ship that to China to be processed before it can be returned back to be put into products like batteries and motors. The challenges are how vertically integrated a lot of these supply chains are. So I think there had been an assumption when critical mineral security first started becoming a policymaker priority that you just need to have more mines and more extraction. And then there was a recognition that it doesn't help to have just the mines if you don't also have the processing. If you have the mines and the processing, you don't actually have the products that they're going to go into. That's a further challenge. So you start to work through the full supply chain. Why we focus on supply chain security. You start to see the interrelated nature that goes along with many of these key technologies, and ensuring some amount of domestic or ally production capacity in order to ensure that you're not vulnerable. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and that's certainly true for the supply chain. When you run down the list of critical minerals and key process materials, increasingly you see those concentrated in China in particular, with a lot of the extraction and processing having been pushed out of the US and its allies into places like the global south. Many of those projects are funded by, controlled by Chinese investors, which leads to geostrategic benefits for China and risks for the US and our allies. This is not a case of needing or wanting to decouple. It's about de-risking. So finding ways to deconcentrate supply and processing capabilities to a more diffuse set of stakeholders around the world, particularly ones that are allies and not adversaries. There's a number of different mechanisms to do that. There's certainly a lot of focus right now in the US on energy dominance, which we're supportive of. The idea of produce more energy, address affordability, and find ways to ultimately be clear-eyed on our supply chain vulnerabilities. To onshore or friendshore. It's not easy, but it's already underway. There is a lot of interest and investment happening in North America and Europe, projects that are potentially financed through US, European, global allies to de-risk the supply chain and ensure that the minerals we need to meet our everyday lifestyles, to keep products affordable, and to keep industrial base functioning don't all come from one country. Chip manufacturing, battery capacity, AI and frontier models, and then actually recycling, I think, would be the fourth. This idea of either urban or above ground mines effectively. There are a huge amount of the resources and materials that we need currently in circulation. You can reclaim those. We think there's some really interesting innovation taking place there. On the battery front, batteries consume a tremendous amount of the critical minerals that we care most about. A robust and growing battery industrial base is a critical component, no pun intended, to ensuring that sort of supply chain health. They're increasingly not just for smartphones and household electronics, they're for major pieces of transportation, as well as increasingly for military applications on the battlefield. AI and chips, I think that is one place where, for now, we continue to see strong Western competition, leadership. I think there are reasons to be concerned about preserving that sort of leadership. There's a lot of discussion right now around the kind of the race for AI. A lot of that centers on the build out of the infrastructure necessary to support deployment and scaling. Much of that focuses on data centers. Those data centers require power, which gets us right back to energy security as the underlying item that will allow us to effectively compete or not in these sorts of frontier technologies. It keeps me awake at night, but some of that being awake is being hopeful. There's a lot of very productive action taking place in the US and Europe and with our allies to try to address some of these concerns in very real ways. We have been talking as an organization about energy security for more than 20 years. There was a solid decade there where energy security wasn't really on politicians or the public's radar. That has very much changed here in the past couple of years. And we've been talking about critical mineral supply chain security for a decade. It's only in recent years that we have seen political appetite and public appetite to actually address this. I think that's a good sign. There is a lot of work left to be done. It's going to take a lot of resources. It's going to take a lot of political capital and political courage. But we're starting to see that materialize, certainly in the US and also with our allies.